My mom told my wife not to include her in Mother's Day because her church is boycotting it for God, then said she wouldn't see our kids anymore unless we went with her. My wife and I always take our moms to a restaurant on Mother's Day weekend with our 2 kids, and will sometimes do something fun afterwards, such as a movie or hanging out in the backyard. However, things have been difficult for my mom since my father passed away some years ago, and it led to a relapse in drinking that she stopped for some time when he was alive, along with some depression too. Things began to get better when one of her friends invited her to church, and she's attended for almost 2 years, which coincided with her dropping alcohol again, along with improvements to her mental health, as she got more involved with midweek church support groups. However, that came with some negative side effects that led to me putting up boundaries with her. My mom wasn't raised religious growing up, but she began to change upon going, which later led to me making this post. One of the earliest things she began doing was criticizing the radio in my car for not being Christian music when driving her to doctor's appointments, something I ignored because driver picks the radio. But when she criticized my wife for not bringing our kids to her church's Sunday school, my wife told me, and I told Mom, that while we're happy that church has helped her depression and cutting back on alcohol, we personally disagree with indoctrinating kids, but she didn't like my answer. She said I owed it to her to take them because her husband wasn't saved and wouldn't be in heaven with her, and she didn't want the same for her grandchildren. But when I held firm on my stance, she said I was failing as a parent before we eventually dropped it. But when she criticized my wife's parenting for almost an hour while at a little league game for our son some months back, a game I wasn't present for, that also made her cry. That led to us deciding to set boundaries and taking a break from driving, telling her about sporting events for our kids. Our decision was also based on Mom's newfound willingness to pester my wife via text about who she'd be voting for and why she'd be voting right for the first time after explaining how she, wrongly, voted left before going to church. My wife told her nicely that she didn't feel comfortable discussing politics, but Mom ignored her and continued telling her who she should vote for. That finally brings me to Mother's Day. When we set boundaries, we took a break from bringing her to our kids' sporting events, but decided to keep holiday gatherings until she improved. But as of this weekend, Mom called my wife and told her that she didn't want to be included in Mother's Day activities because her church was boycotting Mother's Day after the pastor's wife spoke about how too many women skip church to go to breakfast, when God should always come first no matter the holiday. So for that reason, her church was having a Mother's Day luncheon after service where they wanted mothers to invite their families to church for the holiday, and she wanted us to come with the kids to hear a message about mothers from God. But when my wife said she would talk to me about it, Mom criticized her for always having to ask me and said she needed to grow a spine, which I don't appreciate. She also told her that our kids needed to be in church and that she wouldn't spend other holidays with us unless we came, and I'm quite aggravated with her at the moment. So, in conclusion, here is my question. My wife thinks we should cut her off permanently, but I'm in charge of driving her to doctor's appointments along with getting her medication because she can't drive. So that makes it slightly complicated to cut her off since her health depends on us. She said she doesn't want a nurse or retirement home. But if it weren't for that, I'm right there with her. My wife offered the idea of only me keeping contact for the sole purpose of doctors only, but she's also unsure and suggested counseling on the matter, and I'm open to doing that together. But as we're looking into counseling options, I wanted to ask Reddit in case anyone else is a caretaker for a difficult person and how to navigate when the relationship changes, and I appreciate any and all advice. Edit. 1 hour after making my post, it has already been worth it. Others suggested having my mom be driven to the doctor from church friends or an Uber, and I hadn't thought of that before this post. My wife has considered cutting her off in the past and blocking her, but changed her mind every time due to my mom being in a wheelchair and wanting to try and be the bigger person. She is now ready to block her and move on, and the only reason I didn't cut her off sooner was due to her being in a wheelchair until receiving suggestions to tell her to let church friends or an Uber drive her instead of us. So, we no longer have to tolerate it. Mom was never like this before Dad passed, and she started going to church. But she kept harping on how she realized that her husband wouldn't be in heaven after getting saved herself. So she wanted her grandchildren to go to heaven, and said we owed it to her to bring them to church. And when I told her we disagree with indoctrinating children, especially with how Christianity can screw with your mind if they ever want to come out in the future, she called me selfish among other things, and she seems to be driven from losing her husband. I think this church has become an unhealthy coping mechanism for her emotional trauma of losing her husband after she refused counseling for her depression when we suggested way back closer to Dad's passing. Here's what crazy though. Her whole personality changed in under 2 years of going to that church and becoming a Christian. She's become fixated on hell and wanting our grandkids to go to church so that her grandkids would go to heaven and not be separated from her like Dad who died unsaved. And she even flipped her political parties too, and became very outspoken about it, when she used to hardly talk politics and was somewhat reserved. Update: some people asked what we ended up doing, so I wanted to provide an update for those who helped. But before I do, there's one thing I want to address. Many people asked why I didn't cut my mom out of our lives immediately after she made my wife cry at a baseball game, and I discussed cutting her off when it happened. However, my wife disagreed and said my mom needed support in two ways: seeing the kids and driving her shopping and to doctors. We set a boundary of no longer taking her to our kids' games, but my wife also said that her seeing the kids for holidays would help her overcome the loss of her husband, and she believed that losing access to their sporting events would make her change. However, the biggest reason my wife didn't want to cut her off is because she's a Christian too, and she was happy when my mom got saved, and believed we should turn the cheek, despite the baseball incident, because God loved us when we didn't deserve it. So we agreed to just remove her from sporting events to see if she'd change. Personally, I'm not a Christian, but my wife and I think similarly. She despises how many Christians criticize gays and abortion, and believes that God loves all people for who they are. And she said she'd be supportive if our kids came out too. That brings me to what happened since my original post. After my mom told my wife to grow a spine and stop bringing everything she suggests to me in unity, my wife reached her breaking point and wanted to officially cut her off. And thanks to helpful comments that told us how to have her prescriptions delivered and suggest having one of her church friends / Uber take her to doctors if she's going to continue verbally abusing my wife family, I sat down with her and gave her those options, and she didn't like anything I had to say. She reiterated how I was failing my kids when I told her we wouldn't bring them to church for Mother's Day in exchange for her no longer spending time with our family as she threatened, because family time isn't conditional. And when I asked how she could throw away who she was before Grandpa passed, she reiterated how she regretted accepting Christ before Grandpa passed, and that he wasn't in heaven because of it. So when she told me that she didn't want me taking her shopping or to the doctor anymore, she said I wasn't her child anymore because I was preventing her from being around my kids. So she basically disowned me in hopes that I'd cave and bring my kids to church on Mother's Day coming up, and my wife and I have no plans to do so. It's been really hard the past few days since we spoke, but my wife supports our boundary and added one more reason why she hit her breaking point. During a recent argument between my wife and mom, my mom asked her why she wouldn't bring our kids to her church or any church at all when my wife is a Christian. And my wife told her that she hasn't attended any church since 2016 because church in America has changed in many places. The church my wife attended began becoming more political, even to the point of endorsing the 45th president from the pulpit during sermons and occasionally making comments about gays' abortion. And she believes that church is supposed to be about love and not hate like too many churches have forgotten since 2016. So for that reason, my wife simply reads her Bible at home and said she'll never enter a church again outside of a funeral because too many churches worship Trump instead of God. And my mom called her a fake Christian despite only being a Christian for 2 years since Grandpa died compared to my wife who's been a Christian for much longer. We plan to stay firm to our boundary on Mother's Day, but it honestly hurts to have been disowned. So if anyone has any suggestions about coping with that, I'd appreciate it, although my wife has been supportive. And we're trying to figure out how to tell our kids that Grandma likely won't be a part of our lives anymore, along with the importance of choosing religion, or not for themselves, which is why we're making the boundary with Grandma. So if anyone has any suggestions on how to speak to our kids too, we'd appreciate that as well.